Wonderful. So we're going to launch on to our second talk in this mini conference on Humanae Vitae and human happiness. So please, if you'll take out of your folders the handout for talk 2 that says context, context, context. So I want to apologize. We kind of did all the fun stuff first, watching the fun video and the PowerPoints. We just have to now kind of dig in and do a little bit harder intellectual work. But what I wanted to do is I wanted us to know where we're going. So you understand what the goal is. So I've kind of already told you the end of the story. But that helps us know why it's important to do this hard work. We're going to look at the history behind what led up to Humanae Vitae, and then we're going to look at Humanae Vitae itself. And the reason it's important is because, well, one of the reasons is because there is a currently, if I understand correctly, a proposal in Rome to reopen the sealed documents of the process that led to writing Humanae Vitae. I'm not quite sure why, but what that means is if that happens, we're going to hear lots in the media, we're going to hear lots circulating, and you need to be able to distinguish between truth and falsehood. And you'll only be able to do that if you know the history and you know what language is correct and what language is misrepresenting what was done. So that's partly why we have to do the history. So in the real estate world, do we have anyone here in real estate? Okay, that was no hands. All right, well, in the real estate world, there is one saying that explains everything you need to know about real estate values and property appeal. Who knows? What's that saying in real estate? That's it. Location, location, location. So too in the world of theology, there's one saying that explains everything we need to know, well, mostly everything, about how to understand church teaching. What might that saying be? Context, context, context. So for example, the context of a scripture passage is critical to its understanding. How many of them do we not understand? For instance, the one about pouring old wine into new wine into old wineskins. How many of us understand that? Probably, okay, we've got a couple, but most of us have never made wine. Most of us have never even seen a wineskin. We don't understand the context for that. And so that's why it's so important. You've got to know the context to understand Scripture. So for instance, in John 6:51, Jesus says, I am the living bread which came down from heaven. What's the context for that? Well, first of all, it's the Old Testament. In order to understand the New Testament, you have to understand the Old Testament. And in particular, the Old Testament manna that God provided to the Israelites in the desert so they would not die. Jesus is saying, I'm the heavenly manna that nourishes you not only with natural life, but with eternal life. So he's contrasting himself to the temporal bread. He's going to become the eternal bread. Because Jesus is going to give us not just a piece of bread that staves off death for one more day and one more day, but he's going to give us the living bread that does what? Unites us in a unitive love with the very source of life. So if we don't know about the manna in the Old Testament, well, really, it's so hard to understand what he's saying. So context, context, context. So in this talk, we're going to look at the context for Humanae Vitae in order to be able to trace something amazing. And I already alluded to it earlier. An actual development of church doctrine on marriage and marital love. So this is what we're going to have the privilege to see, is that we have a development of doctrine on, what did I say?
Marriage and marriage.
Yes, marriage and marital love. I'm going to call it conjugal love because that's what Paul VI calls it. So we have to, in order to understand how a doctrine develops, we've got to trace it. Otherwise, when you hear someone say, the church changed her teaching, is change the same as a development of doctrine? It's not. change means we were swimming along quite nice and all of a sudden there's a break. And we've got something new that's disconnected from the old. A development of doctrine means we're swimming along and now we have something that has been there but not ever fully understood, and now it's brought into the light in a new way. So what we have is continuity and novelty. The incarnation's the perfect example. Continuity with the people of Israel, of the Old Testament, all the prophecies, but now we have something that completely develops that on a higher plane, on another level. And so we have to be able to know how to respond when someone says, well, the church changed her teaching in Vatican II. Is that true? The answer is no. She might have changed her pastoral practices. She might have changed some other disciplines. But she didn't change her teaching. But aspects of it developed. And we're going to especially see this is true about marriage and conjugal love. So that's our goal in this talk. So this started in a really exciting place. You have your handout, correct? We're going to start in the 1917 Code of Canon Law. Woo, right? Exciting. Who here has ever read the 1917 Code of Canon Law? I know a couple of my friends here. Who's never even heard that there's such a thing as the 1917 Code of Canon Law? Right. So the Code of Canon Law, we had a revised code come out in 1983. But for most of the 20th century, it was the 1917 Code that was the Code of Canon Law. And it's where the Catholic Church brings together her doctrinal teachings in a definitive way in order to guide those who form the faithful and make pastoral and legal decisions. Look, you do this in Couples for Christ, right? The Christian Life Program, right? That's a formation program. But you know that manual that you've got that tells you what the talks are and what the content needs to be and how not to stray off? Well, think of that like the 1917 Code of Canon Law. It tells you what we need to teach and what we believe. I want to look at two canons on marriage from the 1917 Code. They're Canon 1013 and 1081. So if you'll have your hand out, because there's no PowerPoint, so I need you to just follow along. So this is defining marriage. Canon 1013, Section 1. The primary end of marriage is the procreation and education of children. Its secondary end is mutual help and the remedying of concupiscence. The same canon, Section 2. The essential properties of marriage are unity and indissolubility, which acquire a firmness in Christian marriage by reason of its sacramental character. And now, the second canon, Canon 1081, Section 2. Marital consent is an act of the will by which each party gives and accepts a perpetual and exclusive right over the body for acts which are of themselves suitable for the generative of children. It's not very romantic language, is it? Right? How many of you are married? Aren't you thrilled to know that you've given a perpetual and exclusive right over your body to your spouse for acts that are suitable for the generation of children? Wow! I mean, maybe that should be the next viral video. This isn't the way we talk, is it? And yet, because this is like the legal authority, the doctrinal authority, it uses different language. The language is juridical and contractual, because it's legal language. And that's why it speaks of primary end and secondary end, because you can identify those. And this is the language that's been used to define marriage going all the way back to the 3rd and 4th centuries and St. Augustine. So it's really important to know we have these unbroken teachings, but we can see how they have developed. Okay, so who could tell me what's the primary end of marriage? Procreation and, thank you, procreation and education of children. I'm just going to put kids because it's shorter. What's the secondary end? Mutual help. That sounds very nice, doesn't it? And what else? Remedying of concupiscence, right? So remedying of concupiscence. We don't speak about that much anymore, do we? You know, you don't hear, get married. Remedy concupiscence. What do we mean by this? We mean, when you take a remedy, what is your hope? What's your expectation? It'll heal, it'll cure whatever the problem. Brothers and sisters, we have a problem ever since original sin. It's called concupiscence. And our concupiscence is our inclination away from God, away from others, away from relationship, because person equals relationship. And so this is why we speak of concupiscence, where we put ourselves in the center of the equation instead of God being on the throne of our lives and being in relationship with God, and therefore being in relationship with others. So remedying concupiscence doesn't mean you've got, a carte blanche to do whatever you want in marriage. Sometimes that's what people think. Okay, get married, I can do whatever I want. No. Marriage is supposed to heal the wounds that have been inflicted on us, both by original sin, but by generational sin. Any of you ever done a mass for healing of the family tree? You're trying to help remedy concupiscence that's been passed on in the family tree, the way that we have been wounded and think of ourselves first, and push God out of the picture. Okay, so this is the beginning of kind of articulating our understanding of marriage. But in addition to these two ends of marriage, we also have two properties of marriage. Who can tell me what's the first one? Unity. Right? When they say unity, they mean fidelity. So unity, another word that has been used along the way, is fidelity. In other words, you are united in this conjugal manner to one person and one person only, as long as you both shall live. The unity means united to one person only. What's another word that we use to describe being united to one person only? Monogamy, exactly. Or sexual exclusivity. Who can tell me, why would sexual exclusivity or monogamy be important? If that's not one of the essential properties of marriage, what's going to happen? Sin? You don't know who your spouse is sleeping with or carrying on sexual relationships with. So things that we kind of take for granted have to be articulated. Why? So that we all take it on as not only a common value, but a core belief. Can you think of a culture that no longer has this core belief that marriage is sexually exclusive? We're living in it. We're living in it.
Everywhere.
So this is why, even though this is, 1800 years old, it's helpful to just say it bluntly and plainly. What's the second property of marriage? Indissolubility. In other words, we're really familiar with this from a scripture. Indissolubility. We're really familiar with this from a scripture. What God has joined, man may not divide. That's indissolubility, right? It is permanent. It is unbreakable. It's for life. In the church's teaching on indissolubility, this has been linked with another word over the course of time. It's the word sacramentum. So when you hear sacramentum, what do you think of? Sacrament, exactly. So it's this idea of marriage being a capital S sacrament, but that is something that has developed in our tradition over the course of time, because the 7 sacraments were not fully defined until the Middle Ages. So in Augustine, you don't yet have this understanding. You have it only in kind of a seed way of sacrament. But St. Thomas Aquinas is going to take and more fully develop this understanding, so we can see how there's this development of doctrine. Okay, so let's see how St. Thomas develops this understanding of sacrament with a capital S. Follow along on your handout if you want. He says, by goodness of the sacrament, meaning sacrament of marriage, capital S, in which an act is said to be not only good but holy. And the marriage act derives from this goodness. The marriage act derives this goodness from the indissolubility. So can you see how it's linked? With the indissolubility of the union, in respect of which it signifies the union of Christ with the church. Would you please circle in that quote the words that you think are important? So we kind of have to train our brains to sift through the theological language and zero in on, okay, what's being said? Okay, over here, tell me a word that you circled. Oh, just a minute, over here. Holy, wonderful. What about you? Do you have a word you circled? Okay, over here. Over here. Indissolubility. What else? Union. What else? Sacrament. Great. Yes?
Good.
Good. That's a very important word. Wonderful. Anyone else? Holy. How about Christ? Might be a helpful word, right? Damon, circle union. Very important word there. Union of Christ with the church. I probably would have circled that whole phrase. Anyone circle that whole phrase? Oh, good for you. Wonderful. Here's how we could summarize Thomas Aquinas' very important contribution to our understanding of marriage in 3 points. That's what's next on your handout. The marriage act, meaning the one flesh union in marriage, is not only good but holy. So who circled holy? Excellent. The marriage act is good, Rami, and holy because of the indissolubility of the marriage bond. In other words, what God has joined, man cannot divide. Through its indissolubility, so see, now he's connecting indissolubility with marriage as a sacrament. So through its indissolubility, marriage is a visible sign of Christ's union with the church. Or to use the language that we've been using today, marriage is a visible sign of Christ's unitive love with the church that's life-giving. So what I want to do is just simplify everything we've done, because this is going to be kind of our reference point for the rest of the day, to 2 chunks of church teaching. Because this will be the context to understand everything else we're going to look at, and the way the church begins to articulate her understanding of marriage and conjugal love in the 20th century, including in Humanae Vitae, in a new way. So we have to kind of know the way it had been articulated so we can see what the development is. Okay, so here's chunk 1. The primary end of marriage is procreation and education of children. The secondary end of marriage is the mutual help of spouses and the remedying of concupiscence. In other words, the way that we are oriented away from God instead of towards God. Chunk 2, marriage is a capital S sacrament, means it's a visible sign of Christ's union with the church, which is linked to the indissolubility of the marriage bond. Now, why is the indissolubility of the marriage bond linked with Christ's love for the church? Is Christ ever going to forsake or divorce his bride? No. You see, so that's why marriage in its indissolubility, remember what Christ says? I am with you always, even until the end of the age. You say to your spouse in your wedding vows, I will be with you always, for better and for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health. This is a sign of how Christ is with us. Even when it doesn't feel like it, he's still there. Just like even when you feel distant from your spouse. Okay, I know none of you ever feel that. But let's just say, occasionally you feel lonely in your marriage, even though your spouse is right beside you. Okay, that can be a human experience. Just because we feel God is absent doesn't mean he is. Because his love for us is also indissoluble. So that means Christ will never divorce or turn his back on his bride. And also that the marriage act, as good and holy, what would be another word for holy? Sacred. Excellent. That the marriage act, notice, this is important. We don't have this in Augustine. But Thomas specifically says the marriage act itself is good. It's holy. We can say it's sacred. Okay, you got that? Okay, good, because we're going to need it for everything else we're going to do. Let's move on to 1930. Something called the Lambeth Conference. Again, has anyone ever heard of the Lambeth Conference? I know one man came up to me at the break. Anyone heard of the Lambeth Conference? Well, we all need to know this for our history of Christianity in the West. In 1930, the Anglican Church, so 1930, I won't ask who was alive then. The Anglican Church, what we sometimes call the Episcopal Church, met in Lambeth, England, to discuss the issues they were facing at the time. And they drafted a number of resolutions, and so they drafted, discussed them, and then passed a number of resolutions. And that year they passed a resolution number 15. And here's what resolution, I keep on saying revolution because it ended up being a revolution, what resolution 15 said. Follow along if you'd like. Where there's clearly felt moral obligation to limit or avoid parenthood, the method must be decided on Christian principles. What are they talking about? Avoiding parenthood. Right, not having children, right? So somehow you don't want the marital act to be fruitful. The primary and obvious method is complete abstinence from intercourse, as far as may be necessary, in a life of discipline and self-control, lived in the power of the Holy Spirit. Are they saying you can just do whatever you want? No, right? They're saying that what we're saying has to be taken in the context of Christian virtue, of a life in the Spirit. Nevertheless, in those cases where there is such a clearly felt moral obligation, and when you hear moral obligation, you can substitute with the word should. In other words, what you should do. So, what you should do, there's a moral obligation to limit or avoid parenthood, and where there is a morally sound reason for avoiding complete abstinence. In other words, there's some moral reason, not a trivial reason, but a very strong moral reason why you can't practice abstinence. And so when this is the case, then they go on to say, the conference agrees that other methods may be used, provided that this is done in the light of the same Christian principles. When they say other methods, what are they talking about? Contraception. So we have to know, up until this point, 1930, all Christian traditions, every single Christian church, without exception, taught that contraception was intrinsically evil. This is the break. And here's the way they say it. So other methods may be used. The conference records its strong condemnation of the use of any methods of conception control from motives of selfishness, luxury, or mere convenience. So do you see the context they're trying to set? We still live Christian virtue. Number one there, under the summary, in 2 points. What's still the preferred method of spacing births? Abstinence. They're very clear. The norm is abstinence. However, a big however, when for some moral reason sexual abstinence can't be used to space births, then contraception is morally permissible in marriage. I didn't give you the resolution, but there's another resolution that, again, reaffirms any kind of sexual activity outside of marriage is a moral evil. So they're only talking about contraception is morally permissible in marriage, but only for what kind of reasons? Serious reasons. This is a slight opening of the door to contraception. But what it does is it creates a major shift in Christian church teaching. Why? Because for the first time in church history, contraception is no longer considered as intrinsically evil. This is the break. So this is what we have to remember about the Lambeth Conference. Contraception is no longer intrinsically, what was that word? Evil. So I want to share a little story about this. I remember hearing a story once about a dad who wanted to teach his kids a lesson. And so he baked them a tantalizing batch of brownies. Anyone here love brownies? Yeah, especially if they're nice and gooey and lots of chocolate, right? And he called all the kids into the kitchen. And oh my gosh, they just eagerly gathered around the brownies, each one wanting to be the first to dig in. But before they did, the father said he had an announcement to make. And he said, I just want to let you know that I added just a little bit of manure to the brownies. Not much. It wasn't very much. So they should still be okay. What do you think his kids did? Looked at him in horror, right? Why? What's the problem? Who wants to eat those brownies now? But it's just a little bit. It's just a little opening of the door. But you see, even adding just a little bit of manure to the brownies destroyed the whole batch. Are you following me? Yeah. Okay, great. When something is intrinsically evil, even if you have only a little bit, it still damages the whole, like the manure. What if someone said to you, oh, you know what, I only murder someone once a year. It's just a little bit. I'm really still a good person. What would your reaction be? Are you kidding? I don't care if you murder someone only once every 5 years. It's still wrong. Why? Because murder is intrinsically evil. Or what if someone says to you, you know what, I only cheat a little bit on my taxes. April 15th is coming. Right? I only cheat a little bit on my taxes. The government will never know. It's so minor. And besides, you know what, they don't need the little bit of money that I'm saving. How would you feel about trusting that person to be the accountant for your business? Or the treasurer for Couples for Christ? I wouldn't want them handling my money. Why? Because cheating, even if only a little bit, even if only in a minor area, is wrong all the time. All the time. There are no exceptions to the rule of cheating, of murder, of something that's intrinsically evil. We could give similar examples with less pleasant areas. For instance, pornography. Always wrong. No exception to the rule. Sex trafficking, adultery, sex before marriage, emotional and verbal abuse, giving a student a grade of F, even though the student earned an A. Right? That's wrong all the time. These are wrong no matter what the situation, the circumstances, or the motivation. So here's the best thing one way we can remember this is that when something is intrinsically evil, there are no exceptions to the rule. No exceptions, because it's wrong all the time. It doesn't matter the intention, the circumstances, the motivation. So all these actions that I mentioned as intrinsically evil are evil because they damage and deform our human nature. What do? Okay, we're walking along this journey from potential to actualization to full actualization to perfection. And what do intrinsically evil things do? Right? They detour us off this path, off this journey. They deform us. They wound us. I can't walk so well. They distract us. And if they're mortal evil, mortal means we die, then they make it impossible for us to reach perfection and therefore our happiness. So let's go back to our analogy of our acorn. What things could we say would be intrinsically evil that we could do to this acorn to prevent it from being fully actualized into a mature oak tree? Okay, so just so we can see how this works, what can we do to prevent, to impede its full actualization? Put it in a drawer. Put it in a drawer. I love it. What else? Crush it. Yeah. What else? Do what? Oh, eat it. Okay, what else? Well, actually, people do. I mean, the Native Americans.
Don't plant it.
Don't plant it. Exactly. Okay, let's say we do plant it. Then what else could we do to impose something intrinsically evil on it? Don't water it. What else? Don't fertilize it. Okay, let's say, okay, it still manages to sprout. Okay, and it's growing up. Then what could we do to it that would be intrinsically evil? Yeah, that's right. Yank it out of the ground. All right, let's say it's still growing. What else does it still need?
Cut.
All those things. Right, we could cut it. Right, we could kind of cut it back, or we could try to cut it off all the way down. Do you see all the things that can happen to this poor little acorn? Okay, think of ourselves in a way as this acorn. We're on this journey of potential to actualization, of full actualization, perfection, the fullness of human happiness. And there are so many things that can derail us, that can prevent our full human growth. I think it's so important to remind ourselves that sin is not sin because God arbitrarily decided it was sin. Sometimes I think we think God said, no, you can't do it, do this, and we say, why? And he said, because I said so. That's not God. Did he make you female because he said so? No, he has a plan. He has a purpose. You see, sin, like all those things that we wanted to do to that acorn, impedes, it deprives, it deforms us. It can even completely cut off our human and spiritual growth according to what is good and healthy for our nature. And here's what's tragic, is mortal sin can even do what? Yank us out of the soil of the church and God's nourishment for our lives. Okay, so what year did the Lambeth Conference occur?
1930.
1930, great. And why is that conference significant?
It opens.
Right, because it opened the door to what? Contraception only in marriage and only for serious reasons. Doesn't sound too serious, does it? And yet, what's the implication? It's stating, by not stating it, but it's stating it by changing, that contraception is no longer considered intrinsically evil. It's okay if you have just a little bit of manure in your marital relationship. Wow, huh? Do you think that the Catholic Church could just ignore Resolution 15 of the Lambeth Conference?
No.
Absolutely not. Because the Lambeth Conference, I want you to know, is like a major earthquake in the Christian world. It shakes everything. Everything, because something that all Christian churches has agreed upon as intrinsically evil for over 1900 years is suddenly pronounced as no longer intrinsically evil. So in response to the Lambeth Conference, the Pope at the time was Pope Pius XI. He wrote an encyclical entitled On Christian Marriage. In Latin it's called Casti Connubii. I know, all these Latin words you eventually kind of have to learn. On Christian marriage. Anyone ever read this, Casti Connubii? It's fantastic. I want to encourage you now with the internet. I mean, I have all these little books. I used to have to go search them all out. But now, so you can read it easily. What I've discovered is that many people, when they hear the teaching of Casti Connubii for the first time, there are two things that happen. One, they're surprised that they've never heard it before. Like, why didn't I even know this existed? And secondly, they feel as if they've just been given a treasure that they never knew it existed. And it makes them feel excited for what other treasures the Catholic Church might have that they don't know about. So I hope you get infected with a little bit of that. That, oh my goodness, if this is a church teaching I didn't know existed, what other church documents exist to help me understand and deepen and enrich my faith? First, so I want to look a little bit at Casti Connubii. First of all, in number 17, he directly quotes the Code of Canon Law. So he directly quotes what we saw from 1917. So we know that he's staying right? In continuity with the church's teaching. And then he goes on, so he quotes this, that the primary end is procreation and the secondary and education, and the secondary end is mutual help and remedying mutual help. Then he goes on to develop a very striking aspect of conjugal love and marriage. So now we're going to start seeing a development of doctrine. Follow along, this is in paragraph 23. The love then of which we are speaking, so he's speaking about conjugal love, is not based on the passing lust of the moment, nor does it consist in pleasing words only, but in the deep attachment of the heart. Can you hear how the language is now suddenly more human, a little bit more psychological instead of juridical and contractual? He's talking about the heart. Deep attachment of the heart, which is expressed in action, since love is proved by deeds. In other words, you can't just say you love someone. You have to express it through your actions. This outward expression of love in the home demands not only mutual help, but will go further. So when you hear mutual help, you should think 1917 Code of Canon Law. But notice what he's saying. The mutual help has to go further. Let's see what he says is the further. This outward expression of love in the home demands not only mutual help, but must go further. Must have as his primary purpose. Isn't that interesting language? He just said the primary end is procreation and education of children. Can you see now he's expanding this? He's saying the primary purpose of the day-to-day life in your home. This refers explicitly to the conjugal act. Now he's saying, but your whole marriage and your whole conjugal love, what is it ordered toward? What's its purpose? It must have as its primary purpose that man and wife help each other day by day in forming and, what's the next word? Perfecting themselves in the interior life. What's another word for the interior life? Prayer. Your relationship with God. Your emotional affectivity, everything that goes on inside of you, so that their partnership in life, so that through their partnership in life, they may advance ever more and more in virtue. And above all, they may grow in true love towards God and their neighbors. Okay, can you see what a beautiful expression and expansion? It's a development of this understanding of mutual help. He's not saying, forget mutual help. He's saying, there's more. Remember the little person my little sponge person? Right? So when you get immersed into marriage, what should happen? It should help perfect you. It should help move you from potential to actualization to self-actualization. So can you hear his understanding of human nature now? He's not just saying you act, you just have to do this act. He's saying this is what your human nature is created for. The perfection of your interior life. And guess what? God has given you someone right beside you to help you on this journey toward perfection. Okay, let's see how in number 24. So 23 and 24 are his primary teaching on this idea of perfection. Number 24. I just have to tell you, so I taught something similar to this last fall in a course, and people had to bring with them copies of Casti Connubii. And one of the participants had brought a copy with him, and in his copy, this next paragraph was omitted. It was left out, which was astounding to me. So that should tell you how important this next paragraph is and how it rattled some cages. This mutual inward molding of husband and wife. This determined effort to perfect each other. Okay, so turn to your spouse if he or she is here and say, I am determined to perfect you. Will you please tell them that? I am determined to perfect you. Okay, they're determined to perfect each other. This determined effort to perfect each other, listen to this, can, in a very real sense, as the Roman Catechism teaches, that's referring back to the Council of Trent, as the Roman Catechism teaches, be said to be the chief reason and purpose of matrimony. this perfection of spouses, provided matrimony be looked at not in the restricted sense as instituted for the proper conception and education of children. Is this still true, that marriage is ordered toward procreation and education? Yes, but he's saying, look, there's a broader context. So looked at not in the restricted sense as instituted for the proper conception and education of the child, but more widely as the blending of life as a whole and of the mutual interchange and sharing thereof. Isn't that amazing? 1930. Divine mercy. Right? Mercy is God can bring good out of evil. Out of this evil, he brings this beautiful statement on perfection of spouses through this joint cooperation, this joint project of their married life in Casti Connubii. So what is the primary purpose of your day-to-day life as a married couple? Right? I'm determined to perfect you. Excellent. So to perfect each other. Let's continue with two quotes now about how marriage is this capital S sacrament. So this is also why this is so important, because he's giving us two very rich development of doctrine. So number 38, Christ the Lord, the institutor and perfecter. Isn't that interesting? From Hebrews. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. When you fix your eyes on each other as married couples, and young adults, I hope you are listening, because you are getting a whole other view of marriage. I mean, actually, you're getting a view of non-marriage and why even get married, because you're getting a whole view of cohabitation. Is cohabitation indissoluble? No. That's the whole point of cohabitation, is you leave yourself an escape hatch. So one time I was speaking in New Mexico, and I was sitting at lunch across from a young couple, and I just had the inspiration to ask them, so tell me, how many of your friends that you know are living together? Because they were probably in their 20s. And they looked at each other and they said, all of them. So this was about 10 years ago. They said, we're the only ones among our friends who are married. And then, this was such a gift from the Lord that I asked this. I said, why do you think that is? Because anyone who knows me knows I'm intensely curious. I want to know everything. And they said, because it's so much easier to say it didn't work out than to say we got divorced. Listen to that. It's easier if we cohabitate. We don't have to go through the messiness of divorce. We can just say it didn't work out. Someone in that situation, are they approaching marriage as indissoluble? No. See, they're already creating the pattern of living with someone, of being in a kind of commitment, but not necessarily with the expectation that it's indissoluble. So this is why all of us have to absorb this and then pass it on. And pass it on. So the institute and perfecter of the holy sacraments, by raising the matrimony of his faithful to the dignity of a true sacrament of the new law, made it a sign and source of that peculiar internal grace by which it perfects natural love. Can you hear perfection? Perfection. Have any of you heard the expression, grace builds on nature? Anyone heard? Can I just tell you, it's incorrect. So don't write that down, please, because it's incorrect. People say this is what St. Thomas said. He didn't. He said, oh, this is going to be so important. He said, grace, guess what word is he going to use? Perfects nature. Grace perfects nature. So if the sacraments are a channel of grace, what's the purpose of the sacraments? To perfect your nature. And your nature is perfected in a unitive love that is fruitful, that's life-giving. This is what he's saying, is what happens in marriage, because it's a capital S sacrament. It's a source of the internal grace by which it perfects natural love. Because that's what you have the privilege of living in marriage, conjugal love. It confirms an indissoluble union, so you can hear, he's quoting the tradition, and sanctifies both man and wife. What would be another word for sanctifies? Makes holy. Makes holy. Can you hear St. Thomas? The marital union itself is made holy. Why? By its indissolubility. It's sacred. Okay, tell me what's jumping out at you so far. It's kind of hard because these quotes are long. I apologize. But there's just no way around it. It's kind of like when you're stuck in Washington, D.C. traffic. Right? There's just no way around it. And if you get off onto a surface street, it'll be even worse. Okay? So thanks for hanging in with me. Tell me, what's jumping out at you of what we've been reading? Maria, what's jumping out at you?
The perfection is always there.
The perfection. That it's there. It's beginning with Casti Canubi. Actually even referenced back to Council of Trent. Okay, wonderful. Who else is known? Romy, I know your name. What's jumping out at you, Romy? Or Edna?
Perfects natural love.
Pardon me? Perfects natural love. Wonderful. Anything else? Kathy. See, you're in trouble now if I know your name. Kathy, tell me what's jumping out at you of anything we've talked about so far.
Sin is not sin just because God says that it's sin.
Okay, St. Augustine, just because God says that sin isn't just because God said so, that there's actually a reason behind it. I'm so glad you pointed that out. Wonderful. Okay, one other person. It's not true or false. I just want to know, like, what's speaking to you at this point?
The true meaning of everything.
The true meaning of?
I mean,
Of everything? Whoa, okay, I've accomplished my job. Right, the true meaning of everything. Right, from the beginning to now to eternity. I mean, this is amazing, but this is exactly what's getting decimated in our current culture. Because they're saying we have no nature. This is why we're doing this hard work. What we're confronting now in gender fluidity can only be true if there's no such thing as a human nature that has a potential in it that has to be actualized to move in a certain direction. Because our current understanding that's being promoted of gender says we construct it. There's not something internal to it that has to be awakened and move toward perfection. I'm whatever I want to create myself to be. And I get to decide what the end is. I get to decide what my happiness, and you can't tell me what will make me happy. And so we kind of all end up like this because we don't know what to say to it. The answer is, you know what? You have a human nature. And it is designed with a particular end and purpose in mind. So can we just talk about that first? That's why we're doing this hard work. To understand it's about the destruction of human nature. Because you destroy human nature and then you can do whatever you want. Because there's no morality. There's no right or wrong. Because something can only be right or wrong based on it moving you toward your end, your purpose. And if there's no end and purpose, there is no morality. There is no right and wrong. That's what we're facing. And that's why this is so difficult. It's because it's just yanked out the whole foundation of Western civilization. Okay, let's just do just a couple more, and then we're going to break for lunch. I want to read the final quote, number 81, which makes me shudder. And maybe after I read it, you can tell me why it makes me shudder. This religious character of marriage, its sublime significance of grace and the union between Christ and the church. What kind of union does Christ have with the church? A unitive love that is fruitful, life-giving. Evidently requires that those about to marry should show a holy reverence toward it and zealously endeavor to make the marriage approach as nearly as possible to the archetype of Christ and the church. Why do you think that makes me shudder? What are they saying should be the goal of every engaged couple and then once you're married? What's the goal? What should your marriage look like? The way Christ loved the church. The archetype. Okay, how many of you would say that your marriage perfectly reflects the archetype of Christ's love for the church? Do you realize what the project of marriage is? We have a crucifix here. Here it is. Here's the archetype of Christ's love for the church. I give you 92%. Right, that's what the Lambeth Conference tried to do. Just a little exception to the rule. No. Here we go. I give you everything. I give you a total gift of myself. I hold nothing back. Because this is how Christ loved the church. Look, he still gives us his body. He still makes a total gift of self to us. Where? In the Eucharist. We say it is Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity. We're trying to say it's the whole Christ. It's Christ's total gift of self. This is what Pius XI is saying. Your marriage is meant to be and designed by God as a living, breathing billboard archetype of Christ's love for the church that makes visible through your words and your actions Christ's perfect love and his perfect union with the church. Okay, do we have a little bit of work to do? A lot of work to do. But marriage, like any sacrament, is for our sanctification, to make us holy. But what does it mean to be holy? It means to be able to fully enter into a unitive love that's fruitful and bears more fruit and bears more fruit. The Gospel of John, I am the vine, you are the branches. Unless you are united to me, you cannot bear fruit. A branch cut off is barren. See, these are all images of marriage and also each of our lives with Christ and the church. This is why understanding marriage teaches us the meaning and purpose of life. Okay, and with that wonderful responsibility of what marriage is called to be, we're going to break for lunch. So let's say grace. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Jesus, thank you so much that you have made us your embodied sons and daughters. You've made us embodied men and women. But thank you so much for the shape of our bodies that tells us that every single one of us is called to a one flesh union, which actually first occurs in baptism, when you unite us and incorporate us into the body of Christ, and then we have the privilege of experiencing that concretely and sacramentally in the Eucharist. And for some of us, you will call us into marriage and give us the gift of marriage, and we have the privilege of living out this truth that grace perfects nature through this companionship of this one person, for better, for worse, till death do us part. Lord, thank you for this high calling of marriage, that Jesus, you reveal to us our supreme calling, whether we are single, whether we are married, whether we are called to celibate or to the religious life, that you reveal this total gift of self that we are called to make in whatever situation or state in life we find ourselves in. Lord, please give us the grace to continue to receive what you want to speak to us, and open our hearts and our minds, and most of all, our human nature, to receive more of you as we receive this food that you have provided for us. Let us pray together. Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, which we're about to receive from thy bounty, through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, someone want to give directions about lunch? Do we have any directions about lunch?
My role's personal.
Okay, so we'll gather again around 1 o'clock or so. second talk. So we left off looking at Casti Connubii and these wonderful, wonderful quotes about how Pius XI develops this understanding of marriage, and its primary reason is to help us perfect the interior life, to perfect each other as spouses. So I want to continue with this talk on the context for Humanae Vitae by fast forwarding to the 1950s and 60s. However, before I do that, I just want to make a couple questions I had on the break, which is I just want to be very clear. The Lambeth Conference in 1930 was held by the Anglican Church in England, which we sometimes call the Episcopal Church. So it was the gathering of their ministers together to meet and to discuss these issues and pass the resolutions. So this was not the Catholic Church. But the Anglican Church is also very large and influential worldwide church. And so that's why this wasn't just a minor event when they passed Resolution 15. And it is, often I called it it was an earthquake. Another way of describing it is it's the watershed event. In other words, it's kind of the beginning of all the mainline churches changing their teaching. So we have to understand what the pressure was occurring at the time when Paul VI was writing Humanae Vitae. But we're not there yet. So we just have to kind of set the stage, the context, in order to understand what the name of this retreat. We're going to look at the courage of Paul VI. And I purposely choose that word because of the intense pressure that he was under that began with the Lambeth Conference. Okay, so what's going on? Yeah.
Is Lambeth a person?
Lambeth is a place, a place. So it would be like saying the Baltimore Conference. So it was a place in England where they met, basically every 10 years or so, to kind of discuss what was going on in their church. So we have to move now into the late 50s and 60s. And during this time, we need to note at least two things that were going on. One was that the birth control pill was being developed in the 50s and 60s, and it was being made commercially available around 1960. So that's about the time it began to appear in pharmacies by prescription only. And so this advent of the birth control pill caused many in the Catholic Church to wonder if this could be a morally permissible means of family planning, because it's a bit different from all the other methods. At the same time, and this is really important, there was an economic theory that was gaining ground in Europe and the US that was predicting widespread overpopulation, along with the imminent exhaustion of the Earth's natural resources. So this is really important to see that these two things are going on. The invention and them being made available, the birth control pill, and this fear of overpopulation. These are happening at the same time. So I remember very well growing up in the 1960s and 70s here in the United States under the threat of the population bomb. I mean, in my little child brain, I can remember that term being bandied about and people talking about, we've got a population bomb, right? If we're not careful, the world's population is just going to keep exploding exponentially, and then there's going to be famine, and there's going to be all kinds of difficulties and maybe even wars and social unrest. And so somehow we've got to stop this from coming. Is that anyone else's experience here? Because I know some of you didn't grow up in the United States. So one or two other people. But for those of us who were around in the 60s and 70s, this part of our cultural history. So we have to remember this is what's going on as Vatican II meets. So Vatican II is a meeting of all the Catholic bishops worldwide of the Catholic Church, and it's meeting in 1963 to 1965. So you can see that it's right in the midst when these discussions about the pill and the population bomb are going on. So who can tell me who was the Pope that convened Vatican II? No, not Paul VI. It was the Pope just before him. John the 23rd. So John the 23rd who happened to have been canonized at the same Mass as St. John Paul II in 2004. So he's now a saint. I want to read a quick statement from John the 23rd's opening address for Vatican II, which occurred on October 11th, 1962. Sorry. It's a good thing I have it in my notes. Ever notice sometimes your memory doesn't always serve you correctly? 1962 to 65, October 11th. By the way, the release of the Catechism of the Catholic Church was timed to coincide with one of the anniversaries of Vatican II. It was released on October 11th, I can't remember now, 30 or 40 years ago. So follow along if you like on your handout. This is what John the 23rd said in his opening address. What is needed, right, so he's talking to all the cardinals and bishops of the Catholic Church, telling them, here are your marching orders. What is needed is that this certain and immutable doctrine, meaning a doctrine that never changes, to which the faithful owe obedience. Who are the faithful? You and me, right? All of us. Be studied afresh and reformulated in contemporary terms. Okay, did you catch that word in there? Afresh? In other words, his goal for the council was not to resolve a specific heresy or a particular doctrinal problem, but to make the Catholic faith more accessible to people like you and me, by using more contemporary and experiential language instead of sometimes the very complicated and hard to understand what I like to call churchy language. Have you ever heard something that's in churchy language? It's pretty difficult because we don't really know those terms. I think today we're trying to do something similar. We're trying to take a fresh look at Humanae Vitae by using new language. Again, I don't think you thought we were going to do potential actualization, full actualization, and perfection and happiness necessarily today. These are more ordinary terms that you and I think in, and so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to find some different language, reformulate what the church has always taught, so that people in our families, our workplaces, who we just have a normal conversation with, somehow we can bring to them this fresh understanding of Humanae Vitae. So let's go back to Vatican II. As I said, Vatican II called together all the bishops and cardinals from around the world to discuss how to re-engage the church with the modern world and evangelize culture. If I understand correctly, it quickly became evident that debating and deciding on the morality of the birth control pill, whether it was morally permissible to use it to limit population growth and family, that was beyond the scope of the council, even though it was a very pressing problem. So John the 23rd established a special commission to study this problem. Okay, the name of the commission was the Papal Commission on Population, the Family, and Natality. But nobody ever calls it that because that's kind of a mouthful. It's simply called the Birth Control Commission. So it was started by John the 23rd. And one of the members eventually was Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, who became Pope John Paul II. So he was a part of this commission, although he was prevented from attending the final meetings of it because his government, communist government, would not give him a visa to attend. So kind of rather interesting point of history that his input was limited. Although I would rather skip over the process of the Birth Control Commission and just jump right into Humanae Vitae, we can't because context. So we got to spend a little time here focusing on the Birth Control Commission, and because its focus became specifically whether or not it was no longer focused on population, the family, and natality. It became focused on this issue of contraception and whether the church should change her teaching, like the Anglican Church, to allow for contraception in marriage. So that became the focus of this Birth Control Commission. So there are 4 documents from the Birth Control Commission that are published in this very hard to find book. So when it was released, it was $225. My sister bought this for me one Christmas for $50. That's how hard it is to find it. But I'm so grateful. Because in here, these documents should have remained private. This is very important. But they were leaked to the press before Humanae Vitae was published. And most likely, the purpose of leaking them was to ramp up the expectation that the church would change her teaching. Right? That let's get it out there, let's influence public opinion, let's, see, and that way we can put pressure on Paul VI to change the church's teaching. Because John the 23rd died after 1 year of Vatican II, and then Paul VI was elected. And so that's very important to know that the documents that are in here should never have been released to the public. That's why I say if they're going to go in and unlock the documents that have been essentially unavailable to the public, these are some of them. Because the only way you can get these is if you find one of these hard-to-find books. So these are the kind of documents we're talking about suddenly becoming available to the public. And again, they won't have any context for understanding them, because I don't think they will have read through Casti Connubii and Canon Law 1917 before they read this. Okay. I want to call these 4 documents in here, and this is on your handout, and this is important: the minority opinion, the majority opinion, the final report, and pastoral approaches. So the first document, the minority opinion, was a kind of internal working paper. We have to understand how these commissions work. So a handful of priests drafted this working paper because they wanted to put forth their opinion, their recommendation that for supporting the unbroken teaching of the Catholic Church that contraception is intrinsically evil and therefore can never be embraced as a good and as a moral way of acting. And so they put together this paper that then they submitted to their fellow committee members so that they could discuss it. This is the way these commissions work. So they put the paper together to uphold the unbroken teaching of the church that contraception is intrinsically evil and therefore always wrong. So they disseminated it. In response, another handful of priests and theologians drafted a second working paper, which represented the majority on the Birth Control Commission. So the minority report, which is that maintains the unbroken teaching of the church, that's the minority position. Very few on the commission held that. Instead, the majority on the commission held what is ended up in the majority report. And it's a rebuttal, in other words, a response back to the first paper. And the authors did not focus on whether contraception is intrinsically evil, but rather they focused on how to accomplish a reasonable regulation of births. Very important. How can we achieve a reasonable regulation of births? Okay, so towards that end, here's what they argue. So please follow along with me. I've given them to you in a handout just so that I'm not misunderstood, and that we don't misrepresent it as we go along. That the church needs to seriously rethink her position of contraception in regard to each and every conjugal act. The church's teaching on the sexual act was valid in the past but is no longer. These teachings need to be updated by taking into account the complexity of the modern situation since times and circumstances have changed. Can you hear this kind of idea of evolution? That things move on and we leave in the past what's in the past. The church, this is very important, this next one, the church has been operating out of a fixed medieval notion of nature, meaning it's really outdated. We're talking like from the 1200s and the 1300s. They're saying that's still the understanding of human nature that we're using, along with natural law, whereas they claim human nature is continually and essentially evolving. The teaching of Casti Connubii was a reaction to the Lambeth Conference and therefore should not be regarded as containing two true doctrinal definitions. Right? They didn't acknowledge the fact that they quoted the 1917 Code of Canon Law. They just said, no, that's circumstantial, that's not church, actual church teaching. They said that from the beginning of creation, God granted dominion over the natural world to man. Is that true? Yes, Genesis 1:28. Have dominion over the earth and be fruitful and multiply. Somehow that one got left off. But man is given dominion over the natural world. Since our biological processes are part of the natural world, then regulating fertility falls under man's rational ability to direct. This is very important. this understanding that God has given man dominion over the natural world. Our fertility is part of the natural world. Therefore, God has given man dominion over our fertility. Can you follow that logic? Because that's really kind of the linchpin. Establishing absolute moral norms. In other words, principles or rules for behavior that there are no exceptions. When we say something is an absolute moral norm, it means we must follow it all the time. There are no exceptions to the rules. They said that establishing these kinds of absolute moral norms are too rigid because they can't take into account the complexities of modern life. The morality of sexual acts in marriage does not depend on preserving the fecundity, that's the word they used, but we could say the procreative potential. So it doesn't depend on preserving, the morality doesn't depend on preserving the procreative potential of each and every particular conjugal act. Instead, and this is again the important language, the overall totality of sexual acts, taken as a whole in marriage, must favor procreation. So in other words, they argued that as long as in the whole course of your married life, you're open to life, like in the totality of your married life, you're open to life. Each and every marriage act does not need to be open to life. It can be closed. In other words, you can use contraception. Are you following that, what they're arguing? It's a very important principle, they're saying. So this means that in some cases, things like the good of one of the spouses' psychological health, or the demands of family life, or the need for conjugal intimacy will require temporarily sacrificing the good of procreation by using contraception. So in other words, we're going to use procreation, but again, not for selfish reasons. It's because there's another good that we need to place above it. And so we're going to close the marital act to being fertile. And then finally, greater importance needs to be given to the expression of conjugal love, an expression that is impeded and even harmed by prolonged abstinence. So again, this is another very strong theme that if you require couples to abstain, that's actually going to harm conjugal love. So why is it important that we understand this opinion of the majority opinion? It's because it's from this perspective of the majority opinion that the final report was written. And it's the final report that was submitted to Paul VI, along with something called pastoral perspectives, which kind of took the more formal language of the final support and tried to make it into more ordinary, approachable language. So you had these two documents. And these are what were submitted to Paul VI in the summer of 1966 as the Commission's recommendations. Now, it's really important that we understand the role of a commission is to advise and recommend. So I'm going to use an example I used with someone on the break. Let's say that Kathy, Raymond's oldest daughter, comes up to him and says, "You know what, Dad? I recommend that you write me a check for everything that is in our family savings account so then I can go and do a tour around the world." Do you think that Raymond is going to follow that recommendation? Is he free to follow it or to refuse it? Yes, because it's a recommendation. This is one thing that's really important. But you see, because this final report got leaked to the press, people interpreted it as having basically as having more authority than it had. That, oh, this is what the church was going to change her teaching to, because this is the this is the report of the commission. So it's very important to realize that the commission's task was to give a recommendation. And then Paul VI receives that recommendation. So let's look, again, I just want to summarize in 2 points what the recommendations were, because we've already kind of seen the layout through the majority report. So in a sentence, the final report recommended updating church teaching to reflect the complexities of the modern situation. That was kind of a buzz phrase as I was reading through these documents and rereading it over and over again, like the complexities of our modern life. need us to update the church teaching by allowing the use of contraceptives where? Only in marriage, as long as contraceptives are used in light of an overall generous disposition toward new life and not for egotistical or hedonistic reasons. It echoes Resolution 15. Right? It's basically what they were saying. That, okay, you can't use it for selfish reasons, but it needs to be permitted because otherwise it's too difficult for married couples. And then secondly, although they don't explicitly say this, this is the implication, that artificial means of contraception like the pill are not intrinsically evil. Right? If we're permitted, can you ever do something that's intrinsically evil? Never. Right? That's the point. If it's intrinsically evil, there are no exceptions to the rule. We don't want brownies with manure in them. And so by recommending that contraception be made morally permissible, they're saying it's no longer intrinsically evil. And therefore, couples should be allowed to decide for themselves, according to their conscience. That became, again, kind of the phrase, the banner that was waved, according to their conscience, whether or not to use them based on the circumstances of their lives and good intentions. So someone, again, came up to me on the break looking at the Lambeth resolution. It's like, well, how do you determine what that is? How do you know when something is a good intention? How do you know, like, when it's morally permissible to use contraception and when you shouldn't be using it? I mean, it really opens up a whole Pandora's box, a whole bag of worms that are really difficult to then try to sift through. So that, in a nutshell, is what was the recommendation. How many of you think this sounds somewhat reasonable? Right? The couples who find themselves in difficult situations should be allowed to use the pill in a very restricted way for planning their families, as long as they use it with good and sincere intentions. Does that sound reasonable to any of you? I mean, I always say when I read this, I thought, oh my God, thank you that I was not alive in 1968 as an adult, because I probably would have been swept right along. Because the language is very convincing. And look, most people, you and I, we're not trained in moral theology. We don't know how to sift through all the nuances and the distinctions. And so this is why it created such a heightened expectation that the church would change her teachings, because it seemed reasonable. And it seemed to be for good. And remember what's going on. Population bomb theory is circulating heavily, and this idea that, okay, the pill is a good solution to this human universal problem that we're facing. I want to read a couple quotes from the final report that was submitted to Paul VI, with the very strong expectation that he would follow the Birth Control Commission's recommendation. Right? That was the expectation, is he would follow what they said. Here's what the report said. So, for it is natural to man to use his skill in order to put under human control what is given by physical nature. That idea that we have dominion. The opposition is really to be sought between one way of acting, which is contraceptive, and opposed to a prudent and generous fruitfulness, and another way which is an ordered relationship to responsible fruitfulness, and which has a concern for education and all the essential human and Christian values. I would agree with that. But notice what they're saying is that the problem is in the attitude. The problem is not with contraception itself. The problem is the motivation that you employ to use it. The next one. Therefore, the morality of sexual acts between married people takes its meaning, first of all, and specifically from the ordering of their actions in a fruitful married life. Right? They're talking about the totality of their life. That's each individual marital act doesn't have a moral meaning in and of itself. They're saying it takes its morality from the whole overall life of the marriage. And then they go on to say, it does not then depend upon the direct fecundity of each and every particular act. Again, the examples that we saw, what if someone said to you, well, generally, I'm faithful to my wife. Over the totality of our marriage, most of my sexual acts are infidelity to my wife. Does that seem to have a problem? Yes, because we understand that every human act, when it's either moving us toward the good or taking us away from it or deforming our nature, right? So every human act, when it has that kind of quality, is either good or bad in itself. I can't do a big bad act and say, well, because I did this good down here, okay, that rebounds to this act and makes it good. No, each act, human act, matters. And they're saying that's not the case. Next quote, the regulation of conception appears necessary. So when they say regulation of conception, what are they referring to? Contraception. Appears necessary for many couples who wish to achieve a responsible. Notice how many times they've used the word responsible? Big keyword. A responsible, open, and reasonable parenthood in today's circumstances. Again, who here wants to have a responsible, open, and reasonable parenthood? I would hope all of us. Those are good qualities. Do you see how they mix in all the really good language? I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but with a little bit of manure. And it's our job to sift out that little bit of manure. To say, no, a little bit poisons the whole batch. If they are to observe and cultivate all the essential values of marriage, married people need decent and human means for the regulation of conception. So it kind of implies that abstinence is not really decent or a human means. Again, this idea that abstinence deprives and prolongs and harms conjugal love. Next one, in order that they, meaning the spouses, may give to married life its unitive value and do so in service of its procreative function, they must develop an increasingly pure respect for their mutual needs, the sense of community, and the acceptance of their common Christian vocation. How many of you would agree with that statement? I would have both hands up. Please circle the word unitive and the word procreative. Those are going to become very important words. And what's he talking about? Can you hear? They're talking about mutual help. They're talking about living your Christian vocation, growing in a sense of virtue. This is a really great quote. I would want this for me, for my marriage, if I were married. And then finally, a further step in the doctrinal evolution. Does that strike any of you as a little bit, Does doctrine evolve? No, it develops. It develops. A further step in the doctrinal evolution, which it seems now should be developed, is founded on a better, deeper, and more correct understanding of conjugal life and the conjugal act. So they're saying what we're presenting here is a deeper, more correct understanding of the conjugal act and conjugal love. The doctrine on marriage and its essential values remain the same and whole, but is now applied differently out of a deeper understanding. This is a really common theme. In other words, if you don't agree with us, you just haven't seen the light yet. You just really don't understand yet the deep meaning of marriage and conjugal love. Okay, so we have another quiz to end this talk. You'll notice that you have some blanks there. What I want you to do, please, is to look back to the 1917 Code of Canon Law, Casti Connubii, what we've talked about so far. What's missing from the majority report and the final report? In other words, there's some really key elements that are missing. So you got to do a little bit of brain work here. All right, do you have some thoughts? Someone want to share one observation that they made of what's left out, what's missing? Yes, please.
So I thought that the part that was missing was the exclusive right over the body.
Okay.
Something around that.
Okay, all right, so it's possible that they could have mentioned that, but it didn't really seem present in what we read, right? That the exclusivity of marriage.
And perpetual.
Yeah, and perpetual. Okay, great. What else? Yes, please, Romy.
In the Lambert conference, the first thing they emphasize is abstinence.
Yes.
Preferred.
Right.
None of that appeared in.
Yes, at least in the summary that I've given you, they do mention it, but it's certainly not prominent. So, because all the talk is about this other, the complexity, the difficulties, the demands. Yes, what else?
And it seems that they're focused more of the decision between the husband and the wife, but never really mentioned about God's role in it.
Excellent. Right? They're talking about what's going on between husband and wife, but what about God? What about His plan? What does He say? Excellent. That's very important. Yes. Nice and loud.
What I understood was if Christ's unitive love, if marriage is a reflection of Christ's unitive love, or we're leaving out the part about being life-giving.
Yes, exactly. So there is actually no mention of this. This is to me the gravest omission in both the majority report and the final report. Unless I just have drawing a total blank, but I've read through them, 4, 5, 6 times. There's no mention of the sacramentality of marriage, and marriage is a capital S sacrament. Now that's huge. If you're writing a recommendation to a pope about the nature of marriage and conjugal love. Anything else that you observe? Yes?
Also, I think the primary end of marriage, like the proper.
Yes, exactly. Right. So there's not a recognition of the primary end, right? So that language is not used at all. You're absolutely accurate on that. Excellent. What else? So can you see how there's kind of this disjuncture with what church teaching has been on marriage, on the marital act? And then we have this, but the challenge is that it is presented in this kind of psychological, very sympathetic language to the difficulties that couples face and to this fear about world population. So here are a few of my observations. Romy, you hit the very first one that I had, that there's no reference to marriage as a sacrament. And it's what you mentioned as well. To imaging Christ's unitive and sacrificial love for the church. Nor there's no reference to our ultimate end, which is union with God. So that's kind of problematic also, that there's no reference to where does this all take us. There's also no clear theological explanation as to why church teaching, which has been unbroken for 1,600 years, on contraception as an intrinsic evil, should be changed. There's no theological reason. There are practical reasons, psychological reasons, difficulties, maybe what we could call pastoral reasons, if you stretch it. But there are no theological reasons. There are no clear moral norms to guide when abstinence, which they still say is the preferred method of spacing births, when abstinence is to be used and when contraceptives could be used, other than each couple should follow his or her own conscience. What does that mean? That's a really kind of open, broad statement. There are also no references to this. Casti connubii, not even present. This idea of the perfective aspect of love. This idea that love sanctifies us. So this whole journey to sanctification the whole spiritual, that's the thing that just struck me, the whole spiritual dimension of our life. This journey seems to be, even if it's maybe not altogether absent, it's kind of like, you know how you have a marching band? Okay, well, the spiritual part is like way in the back. You can hardly even see it. There is very little mention of the aspect of grace. As a matter of fact, I don't know that that word even occurs in either of these. Of God's divine aid and the sacraments that help us take up a life of virtue. Who's called to a life of virtue? Everyone. And help us respond to the demands of the gospel. Have you ever noticed that Christian discipleship is very demanding? Is your life in Couples for Christ sometimes very demanding? Of course it is. It's because you're trying to live the life of Christian discipleship. And so the demands of the gospel are a reality. Think about what Jesus says. Unless you take up your cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and does what? Dies. It remains a single grain. It remains unfruitful. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. What did he tell the rich young man? Leave everything. Come follow me. What did the disciples have to do? They left their nets and followed Christ. Being a disciple of Christ is demanding, but we're not left to our own resources. God is there and present and aiding us. It's nowhere present. And then lastly, the lack of recognition of God as creator, who's already instilled a rational order, a logic within creation. Our bodies have a logic. Right? They're not just randomly put together. This is just not dumb stuff. It refers to the body as sub-rational. And so, because we're rational, that means we need, as it said, to dominate the body, to give order to it. The body already has an order. God created all creation with an order. And so there's no recognition of God as creator who has embedded in creation an order and a logic. But rather we have to take it over and somehow direct it. Okay, so what I want to do is similar to what we did after the last talk. I just want to take just maybe 10 minutes and have you group up again and share something that, oh, that's not going to help very much. Let me try a different color. So again, looking at your handout, which is rather extensive, let's try this one. Share something that surprised you, that struck you, or that puzzled you. Like, whoa, I didn't realize that. Okay, so just in your groups, go ahead and group up, 4 or 5 people. Share something that surprised you, struck you, or puzzled you, going back through your handout.